this passes, there'll be no more live service games. Stop. You know, I can only be convinced so much.
The initiative is part of Ross Scott's Stop Killing Games movement.
We've launched a European Citizens Initiative that, if passed, would allow customers to retain working copies of games they've paid for.
The gaming industry is in a weird spot right now. Over the last 20 years, the modern gaming industry has gone down a path focused more on trying to appease corporate shareholders and attempting to appeal to every unique type of gamer, instead of delivering on fun, unique, truly groundbreaking experiences like we saw in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. While some AAA games do manage to make good on those expectations, this is also without mentioning the ever-growing indie scene, the ability to deliver on those expectations has become increasingly difficult and expensive as budgets, graphical expectations, mechanical expectations, teams, and player bases have ballooned. This then leads many developers and publishers to become even more unscrupulous in their monetization and rights management practices, with stuff like insane month-long crunch, hiring cheap contractors with little to no benefits, going through staff members like copy paper, ignoring and oftentimes antagonizing quality assurance teams, and often taking little or no lower-level development feedback affecting the development side of games, and rampant microtransactions, unfinished and poorly optimized games, Marvel-esque sequelitis, annoying FOMO, focusing more on multiplayer to incentivize longer playtimes in a time-based subscription model, and depending on the company, giving a middle finger to transparency, consumer intelligence, or even just public relations entirely. But early last year, a different aspect of the industry became the centerpiece of the broad gaming discourse: game preservation. This means looking at games less as plain code and assets, and more as an art form. In the same way film isn't just a bunch of actors standing around and clipped together. And like any art form, it should be preserved as well as possible, both for cultural and historical significance. Because video games as we know them today have been around for over 50 years, and in that time, many titles have become unplayable due to both aging and inaccessible hardware. But that's not what I'm talking about here when I say game preservation. Because what if I told you the games in question were still fully functional on modern hardware, came out in the last 2 decades, and still had an active player base? This could describe plenty of games, but in this case, it's about online-only games. Especially in the single-player space, where it is, at best, unnecessary to the gaming experience, and at worst, actively detrimental to it. And while the negatives of online-only single-player games have been known to players for decades, it all came to a breaking point with one little racing game. This is my deep dive into the world of game preservation, Ubisoft, and why the crew matters. Now, longtime viewers of the channel might notice how this video is a little bit different from my regular reviews and long-form retrospectives, and funnily enough, this video was originally going to be just that, a review of one of the most current racing game franchises, The Crew. The only reason it didn't happen was because... yeah. For those unfamiliar, in December of 2023, Ubisoft, the parent company and publisher for the Crew series, announced that the game would have its servers shut down on the 31st of March 2024, and they had already pulled the game from online storefronts so that players couldn't even buy the game. The reasons cited were effectively server upkeep and licensing issues stemming either from licensed music or cars, likely the cars. This normally wouldn't be a massive hindrance to me reviewing a game like The Crew, but the difference here was that it was an online-only game that had its entire experience tied to the Ubisoft servers, despite much of the game being single-player. Before the shutdown, I actually did get to experience some of the game back on my Xbox 360, and while I wasn't all that impressed with the game back then, what I also wasn't aware of was that online-only requirement, because I had almost entirely played the story and single-player missions. Yeah, the multiplayer was there, but because of how the game was structured, combined with the fact that I didn't have great internet back in 2016, if I had internet at all, I didn't really feel the need to engage with it. This all means that since the game is gone, no review is in the works. But that doesn't mean that a review will never be made for the series. It is one of the biggest players in the modern racing game after all, so I would still like to get to it eventually. And while that might sound impossible, it's actually a lot closer to happening than you'd think, because of Part 1, The Crew Unlimited. Okay, so after the servers were shuttered for The Crew, there were a few people that, instead of sitting on their hands and being annoyed like I would, decided to do something about the impending shutdown. A group of dedicated players, namely Rudo, Chemical Flood, Mono24, Gookie, and most importantly to this section, Whammy4, got into a server called The Crew Unlimited. Everyone has their own specific parts to play, but the reason I called out Whammy specifically was because 1, he was the creator of the server, which originally started as just a community for the small yet still very active Crew player base. 2, he was one of the first people to make a call to action for the community to voice their disapproval and to make sure Ubisoft knew they weren't going to live this down, which, by the looks of it, they succeeded in telling them. And 3, he was the guy who gave me the history of the server in a 5,000-word deranged rant. Thank you, man. So anyway, one of their earliest published findings was this: an image on screen displaying both an online and offline single-player mode, which never appeared in the final game. This was enough to give them a reason to dig for a dedicated offline mode, which they would eventually find, with the caveat of it being locked behind a practically impenetrable wall of DRM, which, if you know what DRM means, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but for those in the know, it used VM Protect, which made it so that not only was there not an easy way to bypass the DRM protection, but that the previously mentioned offline mode didn't even exist in the final compilations of the EXE for the game, complicating things even more. And for those not in the know, it basically had the Fort Knox of online copyright protection that you probably don't really care about, and I don't remotely know enough about to explain. But to summarize, shit was hard to crack. So hard, in fact, that even after the server had grown to several thousand members, they didn't even think it was possible. So their next best option was to make a server emulator, which is, as the name suggests, a private server you can use to connect to the game's code and access both the original online and offline portions of the game without having to rely on any existing, and now obviously inaccessible, online modes. The next obstacle was a piece of middleware called Quasal, or Quasal, I'm not 100% sure, which had its own The Crew specific version and protocol, which no other Ubisoft game seems to have ever used, and therefore had no, at least publicly available, documentation. They also had to figure out this special Quasal version / protocol themselves. This is a massive oversimplification, but again, I'm not a technical guy. This is coming as a tertiary word-of-mouth source on the actual process they went through. The team then spent the next 3 months collecting packets and logs for their work, as well as trying to learn more about the servers while they were still active, until the day came on March 31st where the game went down for good. Some people stayed on the game in its final hours and watched as everyone and everything slowly disappeared, and some even streamed the game in its final moments, including one guy for over 36 hours. At the same time, the TCU team finally announced their plans to build a server emulator, as doing so before then could have got them in some legal hot water. This is the part where the proper work began. This work was reportedly grueling and strenuous, leading to many a head-meeting desk moment, which came from things like reading and understanding the jumbled mess of serialized data through the packets they managed to grab, and even rewriting parts of the game's code outright. To quote Whammy talking about this specific part of their development, "It feels like Ubisoft hated this game since its release. VM Protect is one of the worst DRMs, or code protections, to deal with. Every single EXE of the crew we have is protected with VM Protect. All release versions, updated versions, and even closed betas from mid-2014. This game is ridiculously overprotected. We, the guys on our team, have never seen this kind of shit before. No one has ever been successful in dealing with VM Protect in the crew prior, but as far as I know, attempts were made. None of us were involved, obviously. As far as we're concerned though, we had no choice but to give up on recovering the actual offline mode. We then started trying to prototype server emulation software for the crew right away. I've also had it confirmed to me through several pieces of evidence that there was always an offline mode in the code for the crew, and at one point it was even planned to be released, but, and this is technically just some speculation on my part as nothing can be 100% confirmed until Ubisoft goes under and we dig through their records out of the trash like Atari in the 90s, but it's been heavily suggested from trusted sources with knowledge of the game's development that Ubisoft actively sabotaged the release of the offline mode so that they could crunch the team into making more DLCs and working on the next game. Thankfully, the work being done so far wasn't a waste of time. At this point in March of 2025, the game looks to be in a very playable, if structurally limited state, with all the footage I've used coming from beta test over the last few months, which is a massive jump from where they were in the summer of 24, where it was impressive to see the title screen and garage loading in. Granted, in that story, I did leave out a major player in the revival of the crew, or at least in getting their message out to as many people as possible, because at the same time as their original shutdown announcement, another group started to gain attention for their push for game preservation of titles such as The Crew. Part 2. The Stop Killing Games petition. In January of 2024, Ross Scott, a notable Source Machinima creator from the late 2000s turned game preservation advocate under the branding of Accursed Farms, covered the story of the shutdown announcement in a video from his ongoing series covering dead game news. And in the later two-thirds of the video, he talks about wanting to brainstorm ideas on what to do to combat these kinds of shutdowns for high-profile games, and alludes to having bigger plans in the works. And on April 2nd, these plans were fully announced, with the video, the largest campaign ever to stop publishers destroying games, in which Ross talks about the background I mentioned before about The Crew and other online-only games being shut down, and then talks about a campaign which is about getting the attention of local governments through petitions in various countries, in hopes of them looking at legislature to regulate game publishing, so that when an online-only game would be taken offline, the game must now be left in a functional state, with no direct ties to the publisher to do so, and also applying to free-to-play games if they have in-game purchases. Ross also states in the initial video about a halfway house compromise he was willing to take with the publishers, making the associated tools, packets, and other data available so that a dedicated coder, or small team of coders, could make it operational on their own. So instead of something like, let's say, Need for Speed Worlds restoration taking several years like it did in real life, it, or something of a similar scale, could be done in just a few weeks to months. These petitions were mainly started in Western countries that both have a large portion of the game developing, publishing, and consuming sectors, and also have enough democratic practices and pro-consumer legislature already on the books so that they actually look like they would consider this kind of proposal. This means campaigning in places like Australia, Brazil, the US, and Canada, except even my fellow American Ross Scott admits that that's probably not going to happen here, because we rarely get things passed that actually help the consumer anymore, even more so now, and most notably for later, Europe, or rather the European Union. The EU has made several major strides over the last couple decades in pro-consumer rights practices, and it's been shown that their rulings have had effects in other markets because of the EU's strong market influence. Ross specifically mentions in the video from April that, along with the individual petitions in much of Western Europe, they could consider what he called the Moonshot, a European Citizens Initiative, which is like the other petitions but with the major differences of it covering nearly an entire continent, requiring 1 million signatures in order to even be considered, and the big one, needing that kind of support within 1 year of the initiative's start. Related side tangent, but did you know that they're only at about 420,000 signatures in Europe and have only met the requirements in Ireland, Germany, Poland, the 3 EU Nordics, and the Netherlands? So if you were interested in signing up in one of the other EU countries, now would be the time to do it, as they've only got about 4 months left. Or if you're from one of the other EU countries that's already met the goal, or an American like me, you could consider making content to help getting the momentum back on the movement again. And if you were thinking about making content to help promote the Stop Killing Games campaign, might I suggest the sponsor for this video, Wondershare Filmora. Are you a content creator who pours time and energy into producing informative talking videos? Imagine transforming those long videos into short, engaging clips that captivate a wider audience's interest, which you can quickly repurpose for YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, or TikTok to boost your visibility and drive traffic towards that long-form content. Introducing Filmora's new Smart Short Clips. With the power of AI, Filmora automatically analyzes the dialogue, voiceover, and talking points of your lengthy videos and breaks them down into captivating short clips nicely packaged up with a variety of templates. It then applies the ideal background music and sound effects to enhance your clips. It reframes any horizontal video into vertical formats and vice versa, with the addition of dynamic subtitles, making your information more accessible and memorable. The Smart Short Clips is an all-in-one feature that greatly improves the efficiency of creating highlight clips. So what are you waiting for? Maximize the value of your original videos and reach new heights of visibility and engagement. Creating short videos is now as simple as answering a multiple choice question. Just go to the link in the description to check it out, and I'd be interested in seeing what y'all can create with it. Thank you, and back to the video. Now, to be fair to the movement and where I stand when it comes to issues like game preservation, there was some genuine criticism for the Stop Killing Games petition, primarily from certain figures in the game development space and related talking heads like Pirate Software, who criticized it for being too vague in its approach and leading to more harm than good for both the developer and the consumer. And while it might seem a little counter to the ideas I've put forward so far in the video, I would like to argue those points. Because something I noticed last year, and to a large extent the reason I made this video, was because of the kinds of reactions and conversations I saw around the movement that I was not a fan of. Now let me state this outright. I'm not a game developer, not part of the games industry in any direct or tangible way outside of funny game reviews that I know at least a few people in the industry have seen, and I very clearly don't know everything that goes into every aspect of a game's development and publishing. I also don't have any direct ties to figures in the SKG movement, and I can only speak as an outsider, but as someone with connections in both spaces who spent the last couple years learning about game development and publishing so I can make better videos with those topics in mind, I really wasn't a fan of the mob discourse I saw around the petition. And a lot of this objectively negative discourse came from just general misunderstanding and misinformation about what the petition was for and what effects it could or would have. I had two really insightful talks with Racevic, another review essay creator I look up to who has experience in this exact kind of thing because of his damn near 2 decades of experience, and he made me realize that it's just kind of the nature of online discourse. Like when Pirate Software first made his video criticizing the petition, he took a very blunt and isolating approach in describing why it wouldn't work and why it would do more harm than good, saying things like, in the case of live service games, in the terms of service for those, you're not buying the game, you're buying a license to the game. and saying later that licenses like that can be revoked at any time, and how he was disgusted by Ross Scott's assertion that politicians should take a look at his petition because it's a diversion from more serious topics and an easy win for them in the eyes of the public. On that first point, I'm gonna have to disagree with that being an effective measure, because as we've seen on several occasions, writing shit in the terms of service that no one reads and then taking away products or services which you would only know about by deep diving into the TOS is a quick way to land yourself a lawsuit, as we saw with The Crew itself not long after the shutdown. But for the other point, I will actually agree with Thor, because making your movement an easy win that should take precedent over more pressing issues for a major governing body because of how it would appease the masses with little effort is a misguided and potentially dangerous way to look at government policy. We've seen what appeasing the people with service-level legislature or even just promises of policy to get them to shut up and not talk about serious issues looks like, and it doesn't look good. And I'd argue the biggest reason pirate software is still viewed in such a negative light by proponents of the SKG movement is because he said that point in particular was inarguable and delegitimized any real debate he could have had with Ross Scott or anyone else directly associated with SKG. And the reason why anytime I heard someone bring him up in a Discord call, it usually went something like,
"Right, I'll tell you what, you fat little
Oh
cunt.
my god!
Oh my
Oh
God.
my god! The game of this shit!
and the opposite is true as well. I talked with several indie game developers and people with knowledge of how the industry works, and when I brought up these kind of conversations about Thor and SKG, they usually just devolved into calling gamers stupid and misinformed.
Oh my god, the
Hey,
most
man.
narrow
Oh my
minded,
god,
isolated
consider I am
they cannot have
fucking
any
bullshit,
difference.
man.
Everyone has to be black or white. You know what? All they do is complain.
Honestly,
Well,
since
now-
2004
all of these
was our
swaps
last
that you
year
guys
of
are
gaming.
doing.
What the
The
hell are
games,
these
I
fellas
can stop
even
because it's
thinking?
wrong.
And in both cases, I'm disappointed with the behavior that I'm seeing. Because it's also not just ravenous, passionate, and often stupid gamers versus smart, realistically minded, yet horribly stubborn developers on this issue. Because there's a lot of really smart people who are working in the games industry pushing for stop killing games. And there's a lot of really stupid, misinformed people pushing back. It's just like any form of online discussion. The loudest and most incorrect parts get pushed to the forefront, pissing everyone off. Like, this is basically the number one reason I have a rule in my server prohibiting political talk, because it just devolves into this but 100 times worse. And the worst part about it is, it limits the conversations and knowledge sharing that could happen if these kind of conversations were more civil. Like, now I don't think I can show my Discord a pirate software clip of him propping up an indie dev or shitting all over some of the worst practices of the games industry without getting immense hate for it. And I don't think I could share major improvements or wins for the Crew Unlimited or Stop Killing Games to my game developer friends, because I feel like they'd still be negative towards anything coming out of those groups. And I think that kind of mindset is worse for everyone involved. But it's not all bad. Because while not everything in the SKG movement has been positive, there have been major happenings in other parts of the industry that are looking very promising for the future of game development and game consumption, as well as shifts both in the public perception and commercial viability of companies engaging in this type of behavior. Which brings me to Part 3, Ubisoft and what else the industry is doing. There's been a key player in the story that I've been neglecting for most of the video, and that's Ubisoft. Ubisoft has really not been having a good time with things before or after the shutdown of the servers for The Crew, with their recycling of older and older franchises every couple of years, predatory rights practices as shown through games like The Crew, the most annoying games launcher I've ever used, as I found out when I convinced Racevic to join me in my first time playthrough for The Crew Motorfest, and their attempts at a new quadruple A game floundering to a comedic level. For my fellow car enthusiasts out there, Ubisoft is basically in the same spot Nissan is in right now. Although Ubisoft's Honda seems to be Tencent, who bought around a quarter of their operations to keep the massive bloated company above water. Ubisoft's decline did not start with the crew shutting down, as you can see with their stock price that peaked all the way back in 2018 and has dropped 85% since then. But it also didn't do them any favors, as I imagine those lawsuits people have filed can get a little pricey for them. But zooming back out to take a look at the wider picture, Ubisoft isn't the industry. So what all is being done to combat these practices, especially stuff like unnecessary online-only games? On the consumer side, not a whole lot. As while everyone under the sun will preach for people to vote with their wallets, that's only had so much success, and a lot of the biggest offenders in the industry are still getting away mostly unscathed. On the development side though, major things are happening. I mentioned the European Citizens Initiative from the Stop Killing Games movement earlier, but they also have a lot of smaller individual petitions which are mostly pending their decisions, so I'd keep my eyes peeled there if you're interested. In more recent news, there was an announcement made earlier this month that an industry-wide game developers union called the United Video Game Workers, in partnership with the Communication Workers of America and the American Federation of Musicians, now brings game development alongside music and a dozen various groups for film in being the last major form of media in America to have its own union. So we'll just have to see what things it gets done in the future. Outside of the major industry, a lot of work on game preservation has recently been made in the emulator and increasingly relevant recompilation spaces. As with newer consoles becoming retro and abandonware, games that ran on practically just modified PCs are now drawing in attention for recompilation projects, which is basically just turning the encrypted game code back into regular program code for a modern machine to read. And if you really care about modern game preservation, that's the next big thing I'd be looking out for. It's funny, even though the issues covered in this video aren't normally things I would talk about, the fact that it started gaining momentum again around a racing game I find intriguing. Because it's one of the few times I see broad gaming discourse around a racing game like that. But that's also because it was bigger than just one racing game. It's about the medium of video games, and how we need to take care of them or risk losing out on thousands, if not millions of man-hours spent making some of the best things the entertainment space has to offer right now. And I think that, if nothing else, that is why to me and thousands of players that it affects, the Crew 1 matters.